On March 16, the war around Iran stopped looking like a regional exchange and started looking like a test of whether the United States can force open the most dangerous waterway in energy politics. The Strait of Hormuz normally carries about 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas. But Reuters reported that daily Gulf oil exports had already fallen at least 60% by March 15, dropping to 9.71 million barrels per day from 25.13 million in February. That is the kind of collapse that does not stay at sea. It moves through fuel prices, insurance markets, alliance politics, and every navy now being asked whether it is ready to protect a corridor only 2 miles wide at its most critical transit lanes. Now, a different kind of ship is moving into the story. USS Tripoli is not a supercarrier, but an America-class amphibious assault ship built with an enlarged hangar, greater aviation fuel capacity, and the ability to operate F-35B jets in a concentrated aviation role. As the U.S. Navy explains, Flight Zero LHAs were designed to enhance marine aviation capacity in place of a well deck. And that matters, because this is not just about launching strikes. It is about holding air cover closer to the choke point while carrying Marines who can turn pressure at sea into pressure on shore. That is why Tripoli matters more than its tonnage suggests. As Capto Joel Lang put it, we're not an aircraft carrier, we are an LHA that is very uniquely suited to aviation operations, and in a Hormuz fight that may be exactly the point. If Washington is shifting from punishing Iran's network to physically reopening the corridor, then this deployment is not a supporting move. It is the clearest sign yet that the next stage of this war may be decided at the line where naval escort, air superiority, and amphibious force all begin to overlap. What makes Tripoli different is not just that it is moving toward the Gulf. It is that this ship was built around aviation density rather than the old amphibious formula. With the first 2 America-class hulls designed without a well deck, so more internal volume could be used for hangar space, maintenance capacity, and JP-5 fuel storage. In plain terms, that gives commanders a smaller deck than a nuclear carrier, but one that can push air power much closer to the fight and keep it there longer over the narrow transit lanes that matter most. That matters because the ship is not arriving empty. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit had just come off Exercise Iron Fist 26 with Japanese forces, and that package brings roughly 2,500 Marines and sailors, backed by MV-22B Osprey Tiltrotors, AH-1Z Viper, attack helicopters, UH-1Y Venom utility helicopters, CH-53E heavy lift helicopters, and F-35B stealth fighters. Add the escort screen around Tripoli, including USS Robert Smalls and USS Rafael Peralta, and this stops looking like a simple reinforcement move and starts looking like a self-contained expeditionary strike group that can control airspace, protect surface traffic, and insert forces without waiting for a larger amphibious train. That is why the ship's value is not measured by size alone. As USNI quoted Chad Vaughan, "We're not an aircraft carrier. We are an LHA that is very uniquely suited to aviation operations, and in the Hormuz problem, that distinction is crucial, because a force like this can sit closer to the choke point than a supercarrier, keep F-35Bs on station longer, and put Marines within vertical reach of islands, launch sites, and coastal corridors that airstrikes alone may not be able to suppress. The closer Washington gets to a real corridor reopening mission, the more Tripoli begins to look less like a backup platform and more like the hinge between sea control and something far more direct. The reason this deployment matters now is that the United States has already learned how hard it is to reopen Hormuz with standoff power alone. Even with 2 carrier strike groups, 8 destroyers, submarines, long-range bombers, and more than 6,000 strike sorties over 3 weeks, the shipping corridor has remained under pressure from mines, anti-ship missiles, drones, and coastal launch teams spread across Iran's southern belt. Reuters described the waterway as the route for about 20% of global oil and liquefied natural gas flows, which means every day of disruption multiplies pressure far beyond the Gulf itself. That is the strategic gap Tripoli is being sent to close. A carrier can dominate wide ocean space, but it is not designed to sit close to every island, inlet, and missile pocket that shapes a choke point only a few miles across at its most sensitive lanes. Tripoli brings something different. F-35B jets that can operate from a shorter deck closer to the fight, Ospreys that can move Marines fast, and helicopters that can support raids, reconnaissance, casualty evacuation, and maritime security missions in one compact package. That mix does not just punish threats after they fire, it creates the option to hunt them before they shut the corridor again. And that points to the real shift in American intent. This stops being only a strike campaign and starts becoming a corridor control mission, where the objective is not simply to damage Iranian capability, but to keep tankers moving through a battle space that has to be cleared, watched, and held day after day. Air power can punish exposed targets, but the real barrier sits inside rock, concrete, and geography. Along Hormuz province, the Iranian coastal belt was built for exactly this kind of fight, with tunnel complexes, concealed launch points, and missile positions tied to cliffs, coves, and islands sitting almost on top of the shipping lanes. Keshem Island is the clearest example, because it stands inside the strait itself and gives Tehran a platform from which anti-ship systems can threaten traffic at very short notice. That is why repeated strikes do not automatically translate into safe passage. A fixed radar can be destroyed, a launcher caught in the open can be hit, and a pier can be cratered. But a mobile system that rolls out from a mountain opening, fires, and disappears again creates a different problem. Bandar Abbas and the surrounding coast have long been treated by planners as a layered denial zone, not a normal shoreline, and reports on facilities such as the Ogab 44 underground airbase only reinforce the same point. Iran designed this front to survive bombardment and keep shooting. This is where the military logic starts to shift from punishment to access. If the threat is hiding inside terrain that can absorb air attacks and regenerate firing points, then the mission is no longer just about destroying targets from a distance. It becomes a question of forcing those launchers farther inland, denying them access to the waterline, and taking away the positions that let a single missile shut an entire corridor. The next obstacle is not glamour, but clearance. Reuters reported on March 11 that Iran had laid about 12 mines in the strait, even after US forces had already destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels, and that is the kind of threat that turns every tanker transit into a calculation of time, sonar, escorts, and acceptable risk. A missile can be intercepted and a drone can be tracked, but a minefield changes the tempo of the whole battle space because traffic slows, routes narrow, insurance jumps, and the side reopening the corridor has to prove the water is safe again, not just claim it. That is where Tripoli's air wing starts to matter in a more practical way. F-35Bs can watch the approaches. Helicopters can push reconnaissance farther down the coastal arc, and marine aviation can support boarding teams, island sweeps, and rapid responses if a commercial ship is hit or halted. This is not the dramatic image of a decisive strike package. It is the less glamorous but more important machinery of reopening a route that carries about 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas. And once the mission becomes escort plus clearance plus persistent overwatch, the logic changes again. Washington is no longer asking only how to punish Iran. It is asking how to keep a tanker moving through a corridor where one mine, one drone wave, or one short-range coastal launch can trigger another global price shock. The pressure is no longer only military. It is diplomatic, economic, and coalition-based, because reopening Hormuz requires more than US firepower if Washington wants the corridor to stay open after the first escorted convoys move through. Reuters reported on March 17 that the United Arab Emirates was considering joining a US-led effort to protect shipping, and Anwar Gargash, advisor to the UAE president, framed the problem in blunt terms. This is something that is in the interest of everybody, and everybody has a responsibility. Those lines matter because they reveal the real stakes of the operation. If major energy importers and Gulf partners start treating Hormuz as a shared international obligation, rather than a purely American fight, then Tehran faces not just another round of strikes, but the risk of a broader maritime coalition forming around the idea that the strait cannot be left under coercion. But that coalition is still fragile, and that is where the mission becomes harder than the maps make it look. AP reported that President Donald Trump said he had asked about 7 countries to help police the strait, and told reporters, "It would be nice to have other countries police that with us, and we'll help. We'll work with them." Yet the same report showed no firm commitments, While Reuters noted that European governments had little appetite to expand naval missions into the Strait, even as Brent settled at $100.21 a barrel and WTI at 93.5 after wild war-driven swings. That means Tripoli is sailing into more than a battle space. It is sailing into a credibility test, where every escort, every transit, and every Allied hesitation will shape whether the United States is seen as restoring order or carrying the burden mostly alone. Even if the first escorted ships get through, that does not mean the corridor is truly open. Reuters reported that maritime war risk premiums had surged by more than 1,000% in some cases, with hull coverage jumping from about 0.25% to as much as 3% of a vessel's value, which means a $250 million ship could face insurance costs up to $7.5 million for a single voyage. That is the hidden battlefield behind every naval map, because sea control is not real if ship owners, insurers, and crews still believe one drone boat, one mine, or one anti-ship missile can erase the economics of passage in a single afternoon. And the threat is no longer theoretical. Reuters has tracked attacks on civilian shipping in the Gulf, while AP reported that ships were even broadcasting signals like China owner and crew in an attempt to reduce the chance of being hit. When commercial traffic starts changing its identity signals to survive a war zone, that is a sign that the problem is bigger than escort formations. It means confidence has collapsed, and rebuilding confidence is usually slower than reopening a lane on paper. That is why Tripoli matters in a different way now. Its aircraft and marines are not just tools for combat power, they are instruments for persistence, because the mission is shifting toward visible overwatch, faster interception, and enough local control to convince civilian shipping that the next transit will not become the next headline. As International Maritime Organization Chief Arsenio Dominguez warned, naval escorts alone will not guarantee safe passage, which is another way of saying that reopening Hormuz is not one operation. It is a test of whether the United States can create a security picture strong enough that the market believes it. What raises the stakes even further is that the military problem is starting to outrun the diplomatic one. President Donald Trump said he had asked about 7 countries to help police the strait, but the coalition he wants still looks thin, and Reuters reported on March 17 that French President Emmanuel Macron flatly rejected taking part in combat operations to reopen Hormuz during active hostilities. That matters because once major allies refuse the entry phase of the mission, the burden shifts back onto the United States, and every ship sent forward begins carrying not just weapons and marines, but the political weight of acting before the coalition is fully built. This is exactly where Tripoli becomes more important than a normal reinforcement. If diplomacy is lagging behind the battle, then Washington needs a platform that can do more than one job at once. Keep F-35Bs near the choke point. Move Marines if a key island or coastal site has to be secured, and sustain visible American pressure even if partner navies hesitate. The risk, of course, is obvious. A mission that begins as reopening a shipping corridor can slowly turn into a broader coastal control campaign, especially when the first objective is not only to pass through the strait, but to keep it open under repeated threat. What US planners are trying to avoid is obvious. A shipping mission slowly turning into a coastal war. Once escorts have to rotate non-stop, aircraft have to stay overhead, and Iranian launch teams can reappear after every strike. The question is no longer how to pass through Hormuz once. It becomes how to stop Iran from threatening the lane again the next day. That is why Tripoli matters beyond symbolism. With F-35B jets, vertical lift aircraft, and Marines ready for rapid insertion, it gives Washington an option between long-range bombing and a much larger war. Tehran does not need to defeat the U.S. Navy outright. It only needs to keep Hormuz dangerous enough that every American success becomes costly to maintain. And that is why the movement of USS Tripoli matters far beyond one hull entering one theater. If Washington can combine air cover, marine mobility, convoy protection, and constant pressure on the coastal threat network, then Hormuz may reopen in practice, not just in headlines. But if Iran can keep forcing hesitation with mines, drones, missile teams, and repeat disruption, then this operation could become a long and costly test of how much control the United States can really impose on a narrow strip of water the entire world depends on. If you think this deployment is the turning point, stay with us. Hit like, subscribe, and follow the next update, because the next move in Hormuz may decide whether this remains a naval operation or becomes something much bigger.